The idea of the white race is a relatively new idea taken on by certain people throughout the world. But the question is, why was this identity formed? Did the white race emerge out of a natural affinity of people who wanted to be unified? Or was the white race carefully crafted artificially by greedy and corrupt colonizers to be used as pawns in their game of world domination? The evidence points to the latter. And this is exactly what we're going to discuss in this video. And so for us to do that, we're going to read from this book right here called The Invention of the White Race, Volume 2, by historian Theodore Allen. And so you need to pay close attention as we go over the information, because we're going to go on a journey and we're going to climb slowly up the mountain of understanding. So stay focused, because it's all going to come together by the end of this video. And so let's get started. And to do that, we're going to go in here to page 240, where it says this: the art of ruling, so manifestly deficient during Bacon's rebellion, was retrieved. So what's the art of ruling that Allen's talking about? He's talking about the knowledge of keeping a society in order, which is possessed by all leaders of any society that's worthy of the name. And so Allen is saying this art of ruling was lacking during Bacon's rebellion, which was a violent rebellion in 1676, which almost destroyed the Virginia colony. It's where the laboring class, Negroes, and Englishmen rose up together to overthrow the government, which was under the control of Governor William Berkeley at the time. And so they were able to do so because there was no properly established social system, or the art of ruling was deficient, as Allen states. But the art of ruling was eventually retrieved, and here's how. The ruling planter elite had learned to improvise a style of leadership appropriate to the particular weakness of authority and the undisciplined and frustrated citizenry of Virginia. Basically, Bacon's rebellion showed them where the weakness was in that system, and it allowed them to make the proper adjustments to minimize that happening again. Let's continue. Edmund S. Morgan discusses the transition in succession of chapters beginning toward slavery, toward racism, toward republic. And these are 4 chapters in Dr. Edmund's 1975 book called American Slavery, American Freedom, where he talks about the transition of the Virginia colony. Here we go. And concludes that the subordination of class by race at the beginning of the 18th century is the key to the emergence of the republic at the end of it. Meaning taking the idea of race and making it supersede the importance of class. And so he's saying that in the beginning of the 1700s, this was the key to this new republic. Let's keep going. Commentary directed specifically to the relationship of race and class is particularly relevant to the subject of the invention of the white race. In a paper read before the Virginia Historical Society in December 1894, Lyon G. Tyler, son of President John Tyler and 17th president of William and Mary College and editor of the William and Mary Quarterly, noted that race and not class was the distinction in social life in 18th century Virginia. And what is race? It's a dividing of the human family along the lines of physical features. It's non-scientific, and it's a quite inaccurate way to divide people, but it's a useful tool for dividing people who are the subjects of domination. And so the early colonizers, they created categories like black and white, and they began lumping people into these categories against their will, and also incentivizing people to accept these categories. This is what race is about. It's a classification based on physical appearances, and it lets the society know who's supposed to rule and who's supposed to be ruled over. So the historians are saying that in the 1700s Virginia, race became the social distinction and not class. Let's continue. The modern historian Gary B. Nash is more explicit. In the late 17th century, he writes, Southern colonizers were able to forge a consensus among upper and lower class whites. Race became the primary badge of status. And how did the elite forge this white consensus that became the primary badge of status? That's what we're going to find out later on in the commentary. So continue following along. But understand that this was not a natural unity. This was something that was artificially created by the colonizers who had the knowledge and the power to manipulate people into accepting this. Let's continue. Rather, it was only because race consciousness superseded class consciousness that the continental plantation bourgeoisie was able to achieve and maintain the degree of social control necessary for proceeding with capital accumulation on the basis of chattel bond labor. Meaning the acceptance of the racial ideology is what allowed the elite during that time to continue to get rich off of Negro slaves. So race was the key ingredient that kept their money-making system alive. Let's continue. That the plantation bourgeoisie and those engaged in the labor supply trade favored the imposition of perpetual bondage on the plantation labor force can be seen as simply prudent business practice designed, in terms of current jargon, to keep down inflationary labor costs in order to promote economic growth and to make Anglo-America competitive by utilizing opportunities in Africa newly opened up by the expanding global economy. In other words, it was just business from their view. They had to get everyone else emotionally wrapped up in their game, but to them it was just business and another way to make money. And if they had to support a system which kept people as perpetual slaves, then that's what needed to be done. If they had to turn people into black people, turn people into white people, turn people into Indians and savages, then that's just what needed to be done. It was just business at the end of the day for them, for the people who were supporting it. Let's continue. At the same time, it was understood that, as always, success depended on establishing and maintaining an intermediate stratum for social control purposes. And an intermediate stratum is the middleman, or it's a group of people who stand between the ruling class at the top and the ruled over class at the bottom. And so it's similar to some corporate structures where you have the CEO at the top, the president, and other chief officers. Then you have the middle level management, and then you have the technicians and the other staff at the bottom. The CEOs and the officers do more of the higher level thinking and planning for the business. The managers are the middlemen, and the technicians and the staff, they do more of the labor work. And so there's many corporations that have more complex structures than this, but you get the point. And so the colonial rulers, they understood that the society needed to have at least 3 functional layers, with them being at the top doing all the big level thinking and planning, and the laborers and the slaves at the very bottom, and an intermediate stratum, or the middlemen, to keep the system functioning and to keep the slaves and the laborers in line. Let's keep reading. Why, then, were the free Negroes and mulattoes to be excluded from that stratum in the pattern-setting continental plantation colony of Virginia? And that's a good question, right? Why didn't they use some of the free Negroes and mulattoes to play the middleman role like they did in other places like Jamaica? He's going to address that later on, so continue following along. Let's continue. In September 1723, an African American wrote from Virginia a letter of protest and appeal to Edmund Gibson, the Bishop of London, whose see included Virginia, on behalf of observant Christians of mixed Anglo-African descent, who were nevertheless bound by a law or act which keeps and makes them and their seed slaves forever. The letter asked for the bishop's help and that of the king and the rest of the rulers in ending cruel bondage. Aspects of discrimination against African Americans also bothered British lawyer Richard West, the Attorney General, who had the responsibility of advising the Lords of Trade and Plantation whether laws passed in colonial legislature merited approval or should be rejected in whole or in part as being prejudicial or contradictory to the laws of England. In due course, West had occasion to examine a measure that was passed by the Virginia Assembly in May 1723, entitled An Act Directing the Trial of Slaves, Committing Capital Crimes, and for the more effectual punishing conspiracies and insurrections of them, and for the better government of Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians, bond or free. Article 23 of that 24-article law provided that no free Negro, mulatto, or Indian whatsoever shall have any vote at the election of burgesses or any other election whatsoever. And so this was a law passed in Virginia to cut them off from not having any direct involvement with the shaping of that society. The Attorney General made the following categoric objection. And so this is what the attorney Richard West wrote. I cannot see why one freeman should be used worse than another, merely upon account of his complexion. To vote at elections of officers, either for a county or parish and so forth, is incident to every freeman who is possessed of a certain proportion of property. And, therefore, when several Negroes have merited their freedom and obtained it, and by their industry have acquired that proportion of property, so that above mentioned incidental rights of liberty are actually vested in them, for my own part, I am persuaded that it cannot be just by a general law without any allegation of crime or other demerit whatsoever to strip all free persons of a black complexion, which is really brown, but he's calling it black here, some of whom may perhaps be of considerable substance, from those rights which are so justly valuable to every freeman. So the Attorney General Richard West, he simply could not understand why the colony was stripping rights from free people who were qualified just because they had a rich brown skin complexion. So he must have been one of these people who did not have a direct benefit from this law being passed. And he was at least able to examine it and question it from a somewhat fair lens. Now let's get some more. The lords of trade and plantations had occasion to look into this said act, and as it carried an appearance of hardship towards certain freemen merely upon account of their complexion, who would otherwise enjoy every privilege belonging to freemen, they wanted to know what were the reasons which induced the assemblage to pass this act. So they had to look into this and find out what was this about. And here's the response from Virginia. Governor William Gooch, to whom the question was ultimately referred, declared that the Virginia Assembly had decided upon this curtailment of the franchise in order to fix a perpetual brand upon free Negroes and mulattoes. That's what the good governor wrote. He wanted to fix an everlasting brand upon free Negroes and mulattoes. Surely that was no unthinking decision. And so that's what the author Theodore Allen is saying. And anytime you read literature about race and slavery and you see someone mention unthinking decision, 99% of the time it's referring to the works of Dr. Winthrop D. Jordan, who suggests that racial slavery unfolded naturally, right, due to a certain set of pre-existing circumstances. And so Winthrop Jordan calls it an unthinking decision. And what Allen and others like Lerone Bennett Jr. and Dr. Audrey Smedley and others are saying is that this was not by some random happenstance. This was a calculated and a deliberate thing that was done. It was a thinking decision, which is what we're going to see right now. Here we go. Rather, this is the author Allen speaking right now, it was a deliberate act by the plantation bourgeoisie. It proceeded from a conscious decision in the process of establishing a system of racial oppression, even though it meant repealing an electoral principle that had existed in Virginia for more than a century. Their system of oppression based on the idea of race was a thinking decision. And when you follow the trails left in the laws and some of the letters, you can see why it's easy to conclude that these people were deliberately plotting this whole thing out, right? Here we go. But upon examination, Governor Gooch's explanation of the thinking that led to the decision seems grossly disingenuous. This is still talking about the governor's decision to remove the right to vote from all the free Negroes and mulattoes. Let's continue. His response to the criticism comprised 4 points. 1. The immediate cause of the enactment of that law, he said, had been the discovery of a revolt plot among African-American bond laborers in 1722, wherein the free Negroes and mulattoes were much suspected to have been concerned, which will forever be the case, though there could be no legal proof. And when you read the full letter, you'll see that the governor suspected the free Negroes and the mulattoes to have been conspiring with the slaves to rise up to cut off the English. So he doesn't trust them, and he believes that they would always align themselves with the slaves. Here we go. 2. Another reason, said Gooch approvingly, had been to make the free Negroes sensible that a distinction ought to be made between their offspring and the descendants of an Englishman, which is to say that he wanted to shape the consciousness of the free Negro in such a way that they would come to know themselves as being inferior to all English people. And Governor Gooch also writes in that letter that they never were to be accounted equal. Here we go. As we might say today, Gooch felt threatened by the pride of the manumitted slave, who looks upon himself immediately on his acquiring his freedom to be as good a man as the best. which the governor clearly didn't like, because in his imagination, the Negroes and the mulattoes, they were to assume the role of the inferior people. And he didn't want them thinking that they were on par with the best, meaning the other English folks. Let's continue. 3. Gooch's perturbation or mental disturbance was all the greater when the prideful offender was descended from a white father or mother, these being mostly, he said, the worst of our imported servants and convicts. Meaning that the ones who had the most pride and the ones that he really didn't like were those who were descendant of an English mother or father. Those who came from the worst batch, which he's saying, of criminals and the servants, right? He didn't like that. Let's continue. The law in question, he argued, served as a way of discouraging that kind of copulation. Anyway, he said, the number of persons disenfranchised by the law was so inconsiderable that 'tis scarce worthwhile to take any notice of them in this particular. Although Gooch's letter has been noticed before by our historians, it has never been subject to analysis. And I wonder why that is. What's there to hide? Maybe the truth. Think about that. However, that neglect is to be explained. Let it end here. For such an examination gets to the heart of the motives of the Anglo-American continental plantation bourgeoisie in imposing not just a system of lifetime bond servitude only on persons of African descent, but a system of racial oppression by denying recognition of, refusing to acknowledge, delegitimizing, so far as African Americans were concerned, the normal social distinctions characteristic of capitalist society. Consider the points of the Gooch theses in that light. As noted in Chapter 12 in the Anglo-Caribbean societies, the security of the social order based on lifetime servitude of Africans and African Caribbeans was deliberately linked to the making of such a social distinction among persons of African ancestry. Meaning in that setting, they used persons of African descent instead of Europeans as the middlemen to control some of the West Indian societies, and for various economic and practical reasons. In the early 1720s, at the same time that Virginia Assembly was emphasizing the exclusion of free Negroes from any place in the intermediate social control stratum, in Barbados, free Negroes and free persons of color, like other free persons, were required to serve in the colony militia. And in Jamaica, the Assembly offered free Negroes and persons of color free homesteads. And so he's showing how during the same period, these English colonies were using, in one instance, people of African descent to control the society. And in a different instance, like in Virginia, they were excluding people of African descent altogether from any middleman position. Here we go. In both cases, the policies were calculated to promote and maintain social control and the security of the colonies. Far from undermining the slave system, the policy in the West Indies proved over and over again to be an effective counterweight to bond labor revolt. It was correctly feared that to refuse to maintain such distinctions was to court disaster. Meaning if they didn't create the social division and use the free people of color to control the slave society, then it would have been equivalent to inviting disaster to come their way, right? Because they were largely outnumbered in those colonies. And they obviously understood this, which is why they set them up in such a way. Here we go. In Virginia, there had been free African Americans living as landowners, owners of bond laborers, livestock breeders, and hired laborers at least 3/4 of a century before Gooch ever left England. Although they sometimes helped bond laborers to escape, that offense was more often committed by European American free persons. Yet no proposal was made to reduce the latter to villains by taking away their franchise. If poor free persons in England or in Anglo-America displayed delusions of social grandeur in such a degree as to discomfort their neighbors, hot ridicule and cold reality would likely soon debase them to the notion. The preservation of a civil society would not require the disenfranchisement of a whole demographic category in order to preserve good order in such cases. The system of racial oppression is not categorized by the distinction maintained between one of the common run of laboring people and the best of his neighbors, i.e. the gentlefolk of the leisure class. Rather, its hallmark or its distinguishing trait is the insistence on the social distinction between the poorest member of the oppressor group and any member, however propertied, of the oppressed group. which is still felt by a lot of people who call themselves black. They feel, a lot of them, that no matter how much status they get or how much money they get, they're still looked at by whites as the N-word. This is what the system of racial oppression is intending to do, to make the lowest of the white oppressor group feel themselves to be superior to the highest member of the black or any non-white oppressed group. I have given such prominence to the Gooch letter because it provides rare documentation of a discussion of the issue of white supremacy among the ruling classes in the 18th century in Virginia. And we really don't know what they were whispering behind closed doors. I can only imagine the discussions that were taking place verbally, right? Especially after getting a glimpse of Governor Gooch's written record about fixing perpetual brands on people and wanting to make them feel inferior to English people. Let's keep reading. Although the Board of Trade acknowledged Governor Gooch's reply by saying that it would let the matter rest, historians of the origin of racial oppression in Anglo-America should not be content. How, then, is this categoric rejection of the free Negro to be explained? The difference between the English plantation bourgeoisies in the British West Indies and in the continental plantation colonies cannot be ascribed to a difference of degree of white consciousness. Down to the last moment and past it, the sugar plantocracy resisted any attempt to undermine that consciousness, just as the ruling class did in the continental plantation colonies. The difference was rooted in the objective fact that in the West Indies, there were too few laboring class Europeans to embody an adequate petty bourgeoisie, while in the continental colonies, there were too many to be accommodated in the ranks of that class. And so they had a difficult time getting Europeans to migrate to the islands, and even a more difficult time getting Europeans to remain on the islands after their labor contract was completed. They tried many different ways to incentivize Europeans to come over and to stay, and it didn't work out that well. And on top of that, the land was limited and the cost to purchase land was way too high. So they were left on those islands with a very limited number of people of European origin to middlemen those English colonies. But Allen is saying it was a completely different story over in the continental colonies, where there were too many. Let's read. The tobacco bourgeoisie assumed the bond laborers would resist in every way they could, including marriage, which is escaping off of the plantation, and revolt. Note has been made of the anxiety expressed in 1698 by Governor Francis Nicholson, then of Maryland, over the prospect of great disturbances in which he believed that the Irish bond laborers would confederate with the Negroes. Now what's a story without the ruling class worrying about the wild Irish teaming up with the Negroes? And in the West Indies, these two were reported to have been hiding together in the thickets, ready to rebel. Now let's get back to the story. In 1710, the deputy governor of Virginia reported to the Board of Trade the discovery of an intended insurrection of the Negroes, which was to have been put in execution in Surrey and James City counties on Easter Day. Two of the freedom plotters were hanged in the official hope that their fate will strike such a terror in the other Negroes as will keep them from forming such designs for the future. Alexander Spotswood arrived in Virginia in 1710 to begin his 10-year tenure as governor in June of that same year, shortly after the discovery of the plot. Whatever reliance he intended to put upon terror, experience had shown, he said, that we are not to depend on either the Negroes, stupidity or that babble of language among them. Freedom wears a cap which can, without a tongue, call together all those who long to shake off the fetters of slavery. Although the attempt of African bond laborers to establish a free settlement at the head of James River in 1729 was defeated, Governor William Gooch feared that a very small number of Negroes, once settled in those parts, would very soon be increased by the ascension of other runaways, as had happened with the Negroes in the mountains of Jamaica. So he's talking about the history of the Maroons in Jamaica, and he didn't want his colony to be settled in any part by runaway slaves who could potentially be a thorn in his side. Here we go. In 1736, William Byrd II, a member of the Virginia Colony Council, wrote to the Earl of Egmont, president of the trustees of the Georgia colony, which had been founded 4 years earlier on the principle of exclusion of slavery. Byrd expressed his approval of the new colony's policy and his fear for Virginia's future in view of the rapidly increasing proportion of African American bond laborers. He too had Jamaica on his mind, worrying lest they, the lifetime bond laborers in Virginia, prove as troublesome and dangerous as they have been lately in Jamaica. We have mountains in Virginia too, to which they may retire safely and do as much mischief as they do in Jamaica. And so these people may have been corrupt, but one thing is for sure, and that's that they were not stupid, especially when it came to shaping a society. And they were in constant communication with each other too. They knew what was happening in one colony, another colony over here, and they were using some of that information to make decisions about their own colonies. Let's continue. Open revolt might occur. There were already 10,000 African American men capable of bearing arms in Virginia, he noted, and he warned that in case there should arise a man among us, exasperated by a desperate fortune, he might with more advantage than Catiline kindle a servile war. And what is this showing us? The circumstances that the colonial rulers were examining, which led them to the creation of a society based on racial oppression. They had a targeted group of people, which were the Negroes, and they needed to keep them down into the pit of slavery so they can use them to make money off of them. And most humans, they're not willing to stay and accept that position without at least some resistance, which these colonial rulers clearly understood. And so they needed to be proactive and think many more moves ahead of the enslaved people and use every measure possible to put out the fire of insurrection and rebellion. Because once that fire gets hot, ooh-wee, it's a very difficult fire to contain. Let's continue. In 1749, Virginia council members Thomas and Lee and William Fairfax favored discouraging the importation of English convicts as bond laborers. And why was that? He's about to explain. They cited former Governor Spotswood's allusion to Freedom's Cap, and he warned that increasing the number of convict bond laborers in Virginia who are wicked enough to join our slaves in any mischief, in all probability will bring sure and sudden destruction on all his majesty's good subjects of this colony. And so they understood the English convicts to be potential allies with their slaves and may unite on common cause for the destruction of the colony. And so they needed to put that fire out real quick before it burned hot. Let's continue reading. Nothing could have been more apparent than that the small cohort of the ruling elite must have a substantial intermediate buffer social control stratum to stand between it and great disturbances or even another rebellion. That's the middleman position, or the mid-level manager, to stand between the people who are at the top and those who are at the bottom. Like the capitalist enclosures of the peasants' land in 16th century England, the men of whom the plantation world was made needed an effective intermediate yeoman type style social control stratum. The yeomen in England occupied the middle stratum in the social structure between the gentry above and the husbandmen below. And the yeomen, in one sense, were people who possessed over 40 shillings worth of land. The husbandmen were the laborers, and the gentry, those were the people who possessed a certain amount of wealth, typically from the form of rental income, which didn't require them to work using their hands. Allen continues with this. The present study is concerned with the question of ruling class social control and the choice of a system of racial oppression in the Anglo-American plantation colonies. The concept of yeomen, or middle class in this context, is examined as an intermediate social control category. For that reason, I take as the first criterion the degree to which a planter's or the plantation owner's interest was benefited by the system of chattel bond servitude. The lower boundary of the middle class by this standard would lie between those who owned lifetime bond laborers, the number being augmented or increased by incidental functionaries of the system, such as overseers, clerks, slave traders, on the one hand, and those who did not own bond laborers on the other. In relation to the Chesapeake generally, Kulikoff states that by the 1730s, the social power structure was dominated by the gentry, a leisure class comprising 5% of the Anglo-American men. The gentry were the leisure class, meaning they had a lot of time on their hands, a lot of free time. And how did they use this free time? Was it to sit around twiddling their thumbs? No, they used it to think, and to think about ways to make more money, ways to govern the society, and ways to get more power. That's what they were interested in doing. Now let's read some more about the gentry. The gentry can be regarded as the ruling class, and it was composed of persons whose wealth, however gained, was such as to relieve them of any economic need to work. They didn't have to work outside all day in the field and use their hands to make a living. They also didn't have the pressure of needing to pay bills. They already had enough wealth to take care of all of that. That's why they were the leisure class, right? Who can sit back and think, ponder, and imagine, which put them in contact with the higher echelons of the creation process. Understand. Let's continue. From their ranks came those who actually occupied the post of political authority. And this was their colonial all-star team, which allowed them to rig the laws in their favor to serve their team's financial, social, and political interests. About half the European American men, says Kulikov, were yeomen, and many of them owned a slave or two, or hoped to someday. So to quickly recap, he says in the 1730s, about 5% of the European Americans were the big-time gentry leisure class, and about 50% were the smaller-time yeomen who owned about a slave or two, or who hoped to own one someday. Okay? Being dependent on the gentry for credit to tide them over rough spots or to expand their holdings, the yeomen reciprocated by going along with the system of rule by the gentry. Professor Kulikov relates these relative class proportions in the population to the central concern of the present work, the question of ruling class social control, by concluding that once the gentry class gained assent or approval of the yeomanry, it could safely ignore the rest of white society. And so this was the professor's conclusion, but Allen politely disagrees with it, as we're going to see. But recalling the question raised by Attorney General West, which we talked about earlier, why should African Americans possessed of certain proportion of property have been effectively barred from the ranks of this yeomanry? And this is what Allen says. I have great respect for Kulikov's work, from which I have learned much, but I believe that this proscription of the free African American can be explained best precisely by the fact that, despite its sway over the yeomanry, the gentry could not safely ignore the rest of white society because their bond labor system was antithetical or in opposition to the interests not only of African American bond laborers, but also of all the rest of the population that did not own bond laborers. So Allen is saying that the system that they had established went against both the interest of the slave, obviously, and also against everyone else that did not own slaves. And why would this be a problem? Let's find out. In their solidarity or union with African American bond laborers in Bacon's Rebellion, the laboring class European bond laborers had demonstrated their understanding of their interest, and bond laborers had had the sympathy of the laboring poor and propertyless free population. That's what the problem was. They had already experienced the consequences of their slave laboring system during Bacon's Rebellion, which they had the laboring class Europeans rise up with the slaves and turn Jamestown into a burnt baby back rib, right? They burned it up. And that happened because their system was designed to keep all the laborers and the slaves at the bottom. There wasn't much opportunity for the servants, at least, and the free people to buy land, and also the cost of buying slaves was way too high for them to move up in the social class. And so people became frustrated, right? And when humans feel oppressed and frustrated, they naturally use their energy to rebel, which many times takes on the form of violence, like it did in Jamestown. And so the colonial rulers, they had already been through this before, and they weren't crazy enough to repeat the same actions over and over again. And so they had to do something else, which is what we're going to find out about. What was to be done? What was the alteration in the government, but not of the governments, that would exorcise the ghost of Bacon's Rebellion? And that's what they wanted to know. How could they exorcise or pull that evil spirit out, in their eyes, of Bacon's Rebellion and make sure it doesn't happen again? Here we go. How was laboring class solidarity to be undone? Back to the first principles, never better enunciated by an English statesman than by Sir Francis Bacon. It is a certain sign of wise government, Sir Francis advised, when it can hold men's hearts by hopes, when it cannot by satisfaction. And, with acknowledgement to Machiavelli, Bacon advocated dividing and breaking off all factions and combinations that are adverse to the state, and setting them at distance or at least distrust among themselves. And that's one of the secrets, to break up all things that go against the goals of the state and to set them apart against each other. These people are masterminds when it comes to these intellectual ideas. And Sir Francis Bacon, he is alleged to have been one of the founders of Freemasonry, right? And so if this is true, then we know that he was working with some knowledge. Not working with the devil, but working with some knowledge. And knowledge can be used with the intentions of good or evil things, right? But nonetheless, it's still knowledge. And most people have been cut off from this type of knowledge. Let's continue reading. In the world the slaveholders made, however, hope depended upon prospects of social mobility into the ranks of owners of bond labor. And as we have seen, there was little opportunity for the non-owner of bond labor to make the transition to the yeoman class. The cost of lifetime bond laborers presented a threshold that few non-owners of bond labor could reach. You see that? So many of them were stuck down in the pit, even after they gained freedom. They just couldn't afford it. The monoculture tended to glut the market and leave the small producer who had no bond labor in debt, so that the accumulations of the capital necessary for this path to yeoman status was drained away. Instead of social mobility, European Americans who did not own bond laborers were to be asked to be satisfied simply with the presumption of liberty, the birthright of the poorest person in England, and with the right of the adult males who owned sufficient property to vote for candidates for office who were almost invariably owners of bond laborers. The prospects for stability of a system of capitalist agriculture based on lifetime hereditary bond servitude depended on the ability of the ruling elite to induce the non-yeoman European Americans to settle for this counterfeit of social mobility, which was what? Not moving up the social scale by owning land and laborers, but being satisfied with simply having liberty. Now watch how they packaged this for them and sold it to them. Here we go. The solution was to establish a new birthright, not only for Anglos, but for every Euro-American. The white identity that set them at a distance, to use Sir Francis's phrase, from the laboring class African-American, and enlist them as active, or at least passive, supporters of lifetime bondage of African Americans. That's how they enticed the laboring European Americans to come on board, by giving them this new identity called a white person, the white man, right? Which set them apart from the blacks. Now, Allen uses this term here, African Americans, but he's doing it to be polite because he knows that black or Negro, these are inappropriate terms, right? And they're derogatory terms. And so Allen uses the African American term wherever he can to be polite. But the white identity was used as a polarizing effect on the society, and basically a way of symbolically representing the us versus them paradigm, or the good versus evil, or the light versus dark, and so on and so forth. And so we're going to find out more about how they manufactured the idea of whiteness to incentivize the laboring whites to support the system, right? So pay attention closely because it's going to all come together. Let's keep reading. Edmund S. Morgan introduces a catalog of these white skin privilege laws with the assertion that the answer to the problem of preventing a replay of Bacon's rebellion was racism, to separate dangerous free whites from dangerous slave blacks by a screen of racial contempt. Uh-oh, you better know exactly who it is we're dealing with. You're dealing with big picture people who understand how to use people like pawn pieces in the game of chess. They figured out what the problem was, which was the laboring class, blacks and whites, uniting together. Remember the English convicts who they were worried about, and also the wild Irish coming together with the Negroes for insurrection. They figured out this problem and they said, you know what? We've got to take care of this. We have to do something about this. Now look what they did. In this way, he emphasizes, the Virginia Assembly deliberately did what it could to foster contempt of whites for blacks and Indians. Bruce attests that, towards the end of the 17th century, there occurred a marked tendency to promote a pride of race among the members of every class of white people. To be white gave the distinction of color even to the agricultural European American bondservant, whose condition, in some respects, was not much removed from that of the actual slave. And that's the drug called the superiority complex. It gets people high into the sky, so high that they can put their fingerprints on the moon. And imagine someone in a similar situation as the slave jumping up and claiming that they were in a better position or that they were better just because they had a certain skin complexion, right? And actually believing that to be true. This is what they began selling people in these colonies. Let's keep reading. To be white and also to be free combine the distinction of liberty. And if white meant to be free, then what did black imply? The absolute opposite, which means a slave, right? Think about that. Here we go. Here, then, is the true answer to the issue raised by the unanimous Virginian to the Bishop of London and by Attorney General Richard West and the Board of Trade to Governor Gooch. You remember earlier that Attorney General Richard West asked the governor why they were excluding free Negroes and mulattoes from the privileges of free people simply because they had brown skin. And Allen is saying now, we have finally cracked the code, right? That unlocks the true answer to this question. Watch this. The exclusion of free African Americans from the intermediate stratum was a corollary of the establishment of white identity as a mark of social status, meaning that the exclusion of all free Negroes and blacks from any of the middlemen roles was a necessary result of making white have any real value. Because think about it. Just telling them that they were white, that wouldn't have any real impact if all the blacks had the same opportunities that they had. But what made the white identity way more valuable was when the elite began stripping away rights from the blacks, which we're going to read about in a bit, but let's continue. If the mere presumption of liberty was to serve as a mark of social status for masses of European Americans without real prospects of upward social mobility, and yet induce them to abandon their opposition to the plantocracy and enlist them actively, or at least passively, in keeping down the Negro bond laborer with whom they had made common cause in the course of Bacon's rebellion, the presumption of liberty had to be denied to free African Americans. You see that? It had to be denied to the Negro, or whiteness would have meant very little. It still would have had value because what it symbolically represents compared to what black means, but the extra power was given to it by what these elite did legally and eventually psychologically to the American Negro, which was very tragic and at least one of the most heinous acts that has ever been committed against the human family. Now, Allen continues writing this. H.M. Henry, though writing about South Carolina, posed the question of general relevance. The financial interests of large planters are sufficient to explain why they sought to perpetuate such a system of labor, racial slavery. But why should the non-slave holders, who form the majority of the white population, have assisted in upholding and maintaining the slavery status of the Negro with its attendant inconveniences, such as patrol service, when they must have been aware in some measure, at least, that as an economic regimen, it was a hindrance to their progress? And that's what he was pondering. He wanted to know, why in the world would non-slave holding whites support a system that was against their own progress? Let's find out. The Virginia Assembly showed how it was to be done. It deliberately stuffed the racial distinction with anomalous privileges to make it look like the real thing, promotion to a higher social class. It was a very well performed magic trick, in other words. It made it appear like they were getting something extra when they were not, like they were actually moving up the ladder. But that was not the case. Let's keep reading. The distinction was even emphasized for European American chattel bond laborers, whose presumption of liberty was temporarily in suspension. Any owner of an African American, practically without hindrance, could legally use or abuse his African American bond laborers, or dispose of him or her by gift, bequest, sale, or rental as a matter of course. But by a law enacted in 1691, he was forbidden to set them free. So the owner could treat the black slaves like animals, basically, and it became against the law to set them free, which was not the case in earlier periods of the Virginia colony, where there are records of slaves suing for their freedom and winning, and also masters manumitting or freeing their slaves in their wills. But not anymore. They made it against the law for them to free them, and on top of that, they were able to abuse them. Let's keep reading. On the other hand, the revised Virginia Code of 1705 took pains to specify unprecedented guarantees for the European Christian white limited term bond laborers. Before, masters had been merely required to not exceed the bounds of moderation in beating or whipping or otherwise correcting the bond laborer, it being provided that the victim, if one could get to the justice of the peace and then to the next county court, shall have remedy for his grievances. The new code forbade the master to whip a Christian white servant naked, without an order from the justice of peace, the offending master to be fined 40 shillings payable to the servant upon a second offense by a master in treatment of servants not being slaves. The courts could order that the servants be taken from the master and sold at outcry. Now, did this law apply to any non-white servants? No. And why is that? Because they were deliberately constructing a society that placed a higher value on those who were labeled as white. This is going into the construction of the white consciousness. Now let's get some more. Freedom dues for limited time bond laborers had never been specified in Virginia law, but were merely referred to in court orders by the loose term corn and clothes. The 1705 code, however, noting that nothing in that nature ever had been made certain, enumerated them with specificity. To every male servant, 10 bushels of corn, 30 shillings in money or the equivalent in goods, a gun worth at least 20 shilling, and to every woman servant, 15 bushels of corn, 40 shilling in money or the equivalent in goods. Lifetime bond laborers were not to have freedom dues, of course, but they had been allowed to raise livestock on their own account and to have them marked as their own. But in 1692 and again in 1705 with greater emphasis, livestock raised by African American bond laborers on their own account were ordered to be confiscated. You see that? Systematically stripping the Negro of rights and dehumanizing them, which is going to make the whites feel superior by default, right? This is very magical right now, what we're witnessing. Let's continue. The Act of 1723 that was subject to the correspondence between Governor Gooch and the Board of Trade was by no means the first evidence, in terms of the law, of ruling class desire not only to impose lifetime hereditary bond servitude on African Americans, but to implement it by a system of racial oppression expressed in laws against free African Americans. Such were the laws, several of which we have been previously noted, making free Negro women tithable. Tithable meaning able to be taxed. Forbidding non-Europeans, though baptized Christians, to be owners of Christians, that is, European bond laborers. Denying free African Americans the right to hold any office of public trust. They're dragging them down into the pit right now. Barring any Negro from being a witness in any case against a white person, another level down in descent. Making any free Negro subject to 30 lashes at the public whipping post for lifting his or her hand against any European American, thus to a major extent denying Negroes the elementary right of self-defense. Going further down, here we go, excluding free African Americans from the armed militia and forbidding free African Americans from possessing any gun, powder, shot, or any club or any other weapon whatsoever, offensive or defensive. And at this point, the Negroes were dragged deep into the pit. And when they lifted up their eyes, they found themselves looking at the bottom of the feet of the lowest and most degraded white person. They were in the sunken place, and the pulling of them down, it created this large social gap between them and the lower class white folks, to where they could look down and they can see them and feel better about themselves, although they had not budged one bit and moved any closer to those higher ranks where the ruling class were. This was the great magic trick that they pulled off, a series of illusions to get them to get on board. But wait, there's more. The denial of the right of self-defense would become a factor in the development of the peculiar American form of male supremacy. White male supremacy, informed by the principle that any European American could assume familiarity with any African American woman, meaning they can do any of the private things that they wanted to do with her. Let's continue. That principle came to have the sanction of the law. We have earlier cited the Maryland Provincial Court decision of 1767 that a slave had no recourse against the violator of his bed. The law simply did not criminalize the rape of slave women, writes Philip Swartz. No Virginia judge heard such a case. Free African American women had practically no legal protection in this respect. In view of the general exclusion of African Americans, free or bond, from giving testimony in court. And remember that it was illegal for the blacks to testify against a white person. And these laws had profound effects upon the molding of black consciousness. And it created a worldview which they were forced to accept and propagate in their own children. Now let's keep going. The ruling class took special pains to be sure that the people they ruled were propagandized in the moral and legal ethos of white supremacism. Provisions were included for that purpose in the 1705 Act concerning servants and slaves, and in the Act of 1723 directing the trial of slaves, and for the better government of Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians, bond or free. For consciousness-raising purposes, to prevent pretense of ignorance or acting like people didn't know, the laws mandated that parish clerks or church wardens, once each spring and fall at the close of Sunday service, should read or publish these laws in full to the congregants. So the elite used the churches as a tool to mold the consciousness of the people, and they wanted to make sure that nobody had any excuse to be ignorant whatsoever, right? Now, who else was involved? Sheriffs were ordered to have the same done at the courthouse door at the June or July term of court. And so they were another tool that was used in the conditioning of the society. Let's keep reading. If we presume, in the absence of any contrary record, that this mandate was followed, we must conclude that the general public was regularly and systematically subjected to official white supremacist agitation. It was to be drummed into the minds of the people that, for the first time, no free African American was to dare to lift his or her hand against a Christian, not being a Negro, mulatto, or Indian. And the Christian in this law excluded everyone else other than the whites. So the blacks were able to lift up their hand against other Christians as long as they were a Negro, mulatto, or an Indian. This is going into the conditioning of the consciousness to get it to perceive the whites as being a more valuable people. And this conditioning is still lingering today in the minds of people, right? Many centuries after these laws were created, which is why it's very important to understand this information so you can rise above this type of understanding and this type of thinking and assume a new consciousness, which is the destiny of the Negro consciousness. Let's continue. That African American freeholders were no longer to be allowed to vote. That the provision of a previous enactment was being reinforced against the mating of English and Negroes as producing abominable mixture and spurious issue. That, as provided in the 1723 law for preventing freedom plots by African American bond laborers, any white person found in company with any illegally congregated slaves was to be fined, along with free African Americans or Indians so offending, with a fine of 15 shillings, or to receive on his, her, or their bare backs for every such offense 20 lashes well laid on. Thus was the white race invented as the social control formation whose distinguishing characteristic was not the participation of the slaveholding class, nor even other elements of the property classes. What distinguished this system of social control, what made it the white race, was the participation of the laboring classes, non-slaveholders, self-employed smallholders, tenants, and laborers, which was a major accomplishment for the colonial rulers to create so many people to act as pawns on their behalf. And now that I'm thinking about it, it was almost as if they were forced to become whites and to accept the white identity and white consciousness, similar to how others were forced to become black people, right, and accept black consciousness. The law seemed to have almost made the outcomes inevitable unless these people would have rallied up together and fought back, which they did not do, at least in large enough numbers. So it played out the way it was supposed to play out, right? And thus we have the birth of a system of white oppression right here in America. Let's keep going. In this time, white race social control system begun in Virginia and Maryland would serve as the model of social order to each succeeding plantation region of settlement. The effort bore fruit so far as danger from the European American bond laborers was concerned. The fear, writes Winthrop D. Jordan, of white servants and Negroes uniting in servile rebellion, a prospect which made some sense in the 1660s and 70s, vanished completely during the following half century. He continues with the corollary. Significantly, the only rebellions of white servants in the continental colonies came before the entrenchment of slavery. But that is only half the story. The poor and propertyless European Americans were the principal elements in the day-to-day enforcements of racial oppression, not only in Chesapeake, but wherever the plantation system was established. And so it was the poor whites and the whites without any property who were the main enforcers of this system. And one of the reasons is that they didn't have much else to take pride in, right? They couldn't move up with ease to the ranks of the ruling class. So what better to do than to ensure that other folks stay down in the pit, right? And they love doing that. Let's keep reading. After 1700, according to Worden Baker, every white man, no matter how degraded, could now find pride in his race. You see that? Every white man found himself to be on top of the mountain and looking down basically on anyone else who was non-white. And these people really believe that, right? Which is super crazy, but that's how they were conditioned. Let's keep going. Moreover, immediate control of Negroes fell almost entirely into the hands of white men of humble means. In 1727, special militia detachments known as the Patrol were instituted for dispersing all unusual concourse of Negroes or other slaves and for the preventing any dangerous combinations which may be made among them at such meetings. A student of criminal laws in Virginia relating to bond laborers states that patrollers were the ultimate means of preventing insurrection. Historians who analyzed the Virginia militia records of 1757 through 58 have reported that the muster rolls were apt to be filled mostly with the lower class. Many, they say, were former indentured servants. In colonial South Carolina, even the European American bond laborers were recruited into the militia and the slave patrol, where their role in defense against Negro insurrection was more important than a defense against the enemy from without. At the time of the American Revolution, a number of African American bond laborers were freed by their South Carolina Quaker owners. The law subsequently enacted to prevent further emancipation proved ineffective at first because only freeholders were authorized to collect rewards for reporting violations. But in 1788, effectiveness was achieved by extending this civil function to any freeman, meaning everybody could tell and report people freeing their slaves. Let's keep reading. By this means, says our historian, the state secured the cooperation of the landless whites, who were usually strangely willing to have a fling at the slaves and who, no doubt, were anxious to get the reward offered for such information. And so once again, they found a way to get them involved. In a mode often akin to modern day featherbedding, deficiency laws provided jobs for European American workers simply for being white. In 1712, the South Carolina Assembly, for example, passed a law stipulating that at any plantation 6 miles or more remote from the owner's usual abode, for every 6 Negroes or other slaves employed, a quota of 1 or more white persons must be kept there. 10 years later, the quota was 1 to 10, but that applied to the home plantation as well as those far removed. And this is one of the ways that black consciousness was shaped in a way to view whites as the only suitable people for leadership roles, right? They constantly were reinforced with this imagery and they learned to accept it. Let's keep going. Job preference for whites was to be further guaranteed under a proposal of committee of the South Carolina House of Assembly in 1750 that no handicrafts man other than the owner shall hereafter teach a Negro his trade. Although this system of white skin privileges had not been initiated by the European American laboring classes, but by the plantation bourgeoisie, the European American workers were claiming them by the middle of the 18th century. In South Carolina, white workers were demanding the exclusion of Negroes from skilled trades. Richard B. Morrison's monumental study of labor in the continental Anglo-American colonies found that The effort of white artisans to keep Negroes and slaves from entering the skilled trades radiated from Charleston to every sizable town on the Atlantic coast. In 1839, white mechanics in Culpeper and Petersburg, Virginia, demanded that Negroes be barred from apprenticeship and from any trade without a white overseer. A decade later, a similar petition from Norfolk showed a high degree of political sophistication. Barring Negroes from competition from employment, its sponsor said, would guarantee against jealousy between slaveholders and non-slaveholders. Within 2 decades, slaveholding would end, but the appeal to white race solidarity would remain the country's most general form of class collaborationism. And so there you have it, the breakdown of the creation of the white race to play a pivotal role in the oppression of blacks and also all non-whites in the game set up by the greedy and corrupt colonial ruling class. And so it's quite interesting to see the various components that went into the making and shaping of the white consciousness. And it's even more interesting to delve into the mind of the people who were actually crafting this consciousness. And so one thing that I respect about the author of this book, Theodore Allen, is that not only did he present a lot of well-researched information about the invention of the white race, but what he did with that information and how he made use of it. And so he left a pretty valuable example for those who find value in it. And so I want to end this video by going into this book here, the volume 1 of this series, in the acknowledgement page where he says this: many individuals and institutions have assisted me during the decades spent working on this book. Space allows specific mention of only a few. First, I acknowledge my obligation to 2 fellow proletarian intellectuals, Charles Johnson and William Carloti, who cleared away ideological barnacles left from my previous moorings and taught me to say, as Carloti did, I am not white. And so I want you to think about that as we close out in this video. And so hopefully this video here has given you some extra light to find your way on the path. I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.